So I'm going to kick us off today. I'm an educational psychologist and developmental psychologist by training. I'm really excited to be here to present. I'm not really a creativity researcher, but I've been working on a lot of creativity research with the PhD student I'm collaborating with, Andrea Weichel. So I'm very excited to see these two fields coming together. And I'm going to kind of start us off from this motivational perspective and then transfer into how do we think about creativity from a teacher's point of view. And that's what Andrea will be presenting today. So again, I'm an educational psychologist, so I think since we're starting off thinking about what is motivation, it might be useful to have a definition that kind of guides our thinking and the educational psychology approach to motivation. So we often say that motivation is a process whereby goal-directed activities are initiated and sustained. That's a lot of really big, nasty words to basically say we are trying to do stuff, and it's how do we keep doing stuff and how do we start doing stuff, right? And so as Dr. Abraham is kind of alluding to, this is a really broad set of phenomena. When we're trying to understand goal-directed behavior, everything we do is goal-directed. And so anything that might help us get started or keep us going is going to be under this edict of motivation. So I think motivation is a very broad topic, and it's basically trying to study why we do what we do and then how do we do what we do, which means that there's a lot of different components to motivation that we might want to consider. Some folks have taken a needs perspective to understanding how motivation happens. So in this view, it's not unlike an animal view in that animals have certain needs. They need to eat, they need to sleep, they need safety. And certainly people have lots of needs, and certainly we have lots of needs that are psychological in nature. We have a need to be connected to others. We would call this a need for relatedness or belonging. We also need to have the feeling that we're controlling our own actions. When we feel like somebody else is doing stuff for us, it can make our motivation suffer. And we also need to feel confident. When we're not doing well, we don't feel like we're good at something, our motivation can suffer as well. But there's not just these psychological needs that have been talked about under what's called self-determination theory. There are also needs like the need to express yourself, which I think gets into more creativity. This desire to show who you are is something that is very human and is connecting motivation to creativity. And another need that we'll talk about later is this need for closure, kind of opposed to the need for creativity. This idea that we don't like ambiguity and we want to know what the answer is right away, which may prevent us from pursuing creative means. So sometimes we think about needs and how people try to fulfill them as driving our motivation. Another perspective on humans that distinguishes them from animal motivation is that humans are rational. We try to understand the world. And in understanding the world, we create these beliefs about the way that the world works. And when we try to understand how the world works, we might be able to predict what will happen, and we can make choices in how we're going to invest our limited amount of time and energy in those things. So in this worldview, we're trying to understand what are people's beliefs, and these beliefs might drive them to try harder, or to make certain kinds of choices, or to engage or not engage in the task. Some of these beliefs can be very specific to a task. So in expectancy value theory, they focus on two basic beliefs. The belief about whether or not you can do something, we sometimes call this self-efficacy. The belief that you are capable of succeeding in a task can drive you towards completing that task. Or value, is there some importance to doing this task? Or do you enjoy doing the task? Do you like doing the task? And that can drive you towards activity in that area. So those are very task specific, but some of the beliefs that I'm interested in are a little bit broader. They're not necessarily tied to, can I succeed in this class? They're your broader beliefs about how education works, how thinking works. Beliefs like intelligence, so sometimes these have been referred to as mindsets. The idea that your intelligence is something that can change or not might influence how you interpret something like a failure experience. Are you going to keep trying because you believe you can get better, or do you treat that failure as, oh, I've reached my potential, there's nothing else I can do? I also study beliefs about knowledge. So where does knowledge come from? Is it handed down by omniscient authority figures, or is it something that we individuals can create? Is knowledge a collection of facts, or is it trying to understand how these facts are interconnected? And these different beliefs might direct you to do different actions when you are engaged in educational settings. So as a developmental researcher, I'm also interested in how do kids come to hold these beliefs? And it turns out that parents and teachers can do a lot to foster different kinds of beliefs in their kids. And this is an area of research that there has been a lot of work on. So for example, when you tell a kid that they are capable and that they can do it, that might build their confidence, increase their self-efficacy. You can do this, they believe that they can do it. We also communicate value to our kids. So in some Judy Harakevich's work, they found that when parents say things like math is important, math is useful, kids start to internalize those messages and make more plans for long-term careers that involve things like math. How we talk about success and failure to our children also matters, and that can be from a teacher or a parent's perspective. When we say things like, oh, you're so smart, we might be trying to encourage and support their self-efficacy, but it also sends this message that there's something special and unique about them, which is implied to be a fixed trait or quality. And so we see that sometimes these messages praising personal attributes might lead to a fixed mindset or a belief that your intelligence cannot change, which can have motivational implications later. It might also be the case that the way that we teach fosters certain kinds of beliefs in students that motivate them to engage in different kinds of activities. So if we show a student, this is the way that something's done, we often do this in math, where we'll show what's called a worked example. You do this, you carry the one, etc., and now you do it. It sends the implicit message that this is the one way to do it. And so when we think about creativity or motivation to try something that's different, you may be constrained by these instructions that your teacher is giving you. When we talk about motivation and how many different goals that we have, I think it's also important to take a step back and look at the school context. And if we're thinking about what do teachers do, the school context is a really important one when it comes to fostering creativity. So schools have lots of goals. If we're talking about goal-oriented behaviors, schools have lots of things that they're trying to do, and therefore teachers are sometimes trying to serve many different masters. So obviously schools are trying to teach learning content. We're trying to get kids to know certain kinds of things. But we also want our kids to get along with each other. We want them to be able to regulate their emotions. We also just want kids to show up at school. And so sometimes these priorities, these things that are really important for schools to do, means that creative thinking is not always the priority for teachers. And I think that in my discussions with Andrea, I've come to learn that this is maybe we're missing out on something here, because creativity is not only good for its own sake, but creativity can also be very productive. When we act creatively, we can actually learn material better. We can make connections that we wouldn't have otherwise. And so creativity is really important to have in our classrooms, but it may be posed against a different goal for teachers. I think often teachers are given this kind of dichotomy of like, am I going to teach the content efficiently, or am I trying to create an environment where students can engage in more creative problem solving? And so one of the experiments I want to share with you today kind of gets at this distinction between the instructional strategies that teachers use and how it might differentially foster one of these objectives, teaching the material efficiently or allowing kids to explore more freely. So in one of these experiments, we were trying to figure out whether different kinds of instructional strategies influence efficiency and creative problem solving. And so we had some preschool to elementary school age kids working in a lab, and we gave them some Legos to play with. Legos are fun, kids like to do it, doesn't feel like a big chore. But the nice thing about Legos is that they've got these little dots on them and they come in different sizes. And so you can plug in Legos to do some kind of rudimentary math, even among students that aren't practicing formal math yet. So what we did was we wanted to assign participants to different kinds of instructional conditions. And I'll walk through these one at a time. And then we wanted to see, how do kids try to solve problems using these Legos? These are some of the materials we used. So the goal for the kids was to create these Lego snakes. And the Lego snakes had to have a certain kind of length. So in our example, we showed kids a Lego snake that was 5 dots long. And there's certain rules you have to follow. The Lego snake always have to have a head, because all snakes have heads. And the snake has to stay in the grass, because the snake likes to be in the grass. But then kids get to choose which of these bricks they put together in order to solve that task. But in order to show kids this, we gave different levels of demonstration. So kids all saw this example, but then some kids were shown how to solve a more advanced problem, and were given different kinds of instructions around that. So one group was just kind of given the Legos with the basic instruction, but not shown how to solve a Lego snake that was 10 long. And then we saw how long does it take them to figure out how to make a Lego snake that's 10 long without an example of someone doing it for them. That we call the discovery condition. This is very common when we think about like a control group where kids aren't given specific instructions. We may not expect them to be very efficient at the task, right? We also gave a pedagogical demonstration. This is the way to do the snake. So we poured out the Legos and we said, I'm going to start with this one. And then with this one, I count them up. That's 10. Now it's your turn. So a very clear demonstration of how to do it. What's interesting is we had a third condition here, in which we wanted to show the specific step-by-step instructions, but we did not want to imply that that was the one way to do it. And so we had this very clever design where we put these Legos in a box that has a secret compartment that has the correct answer in it, and we open it up and dump them out so that the right answer just falls out, but the experimenter does the demonstration like, I'll try this, I got to 10. I don't know how that happened, I guess I got lucky. So what's interesting about this condition is that kids see the example of how to do it, but it's not posed as the only way to do it. And we wanted to see what impact this had on problem solving and creative problem solving. So this was the first task. They had to build a Lego snake that was 10 long. You see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The next task we did was supposed to be a little different, and there was only one solution to this task. There was only one combination of Legos that would actually work based on the different numbers and sizes that we had. And we're measuring how long it took for kids to do these different tasks. How efficient are they at solving the task given the instructions? And then lastly, we had this creative task where we kind of changed the rules up a little bit. We say, we want you to build just the longest snake possible. And we put some rocks in the grass, a little obstacle for them, so they had to try to problem solve in ways that they hadn't seen in the demonstration task. What we found, unsurprisingly, is when you don't show kids how to do something, it takes them longer to do it. I don't think anybody who's a teacher is surprised by this finding. It's not particularly novel, but I think it shows the appeal of giving students instructions, saying this is an example of how to do it. But I'll also note that the difference between being told this is the way to do it and just seeing an example that is not wrapped around this is the way to do it, we don't see any difference there. We also didn't see any difference in time when we come to a novel task. So that benefit from the discovery condition is gone by the time that students are doing a next task where they're making a snake that's got 12 pieces long. And then perhaps most interesting to me is what happens when we give them this creative Lego task. And so on the y-axis here, it's how long of a snake did they actually make. So we could talk about the usefulness of their strategies in terms of they were able to come up with a way to put the snake on the board that was actually better at the task, which was to make the longest snake possible. And we see in the pedagogical condition, compared to the other two, kids are making snakes that are not as long. They're a little bit maybe more restricted in their problem solving, maybe because they're thinking of the strategies they were shown of how to do on that first task. To give you an example of what this looks like, this would be the average for the pedagogical condition. You can see the kid kind of wraps around here and just stops, and they don't think like, oh, I could go around this rock. They just kind of give up because they don't have a piece that can actually go directly into the rock. Whereas this kid had the snake wrapping around itself a little bit, which allows you to get a much longer snake. So they're more successful from a creative problem-solving standpoint. Obviously, these are Legos. Legos are fun. Maybe there's something going on in terms of play. We've also tried to replicate this work using more formal math. So we basically take the Lego task and turn it into numbers where they're trying to put physical numbers together in order to add them up to make a certain number. And in this task, we do the same thing where we assign people to discovery, pedagogical, accidental conditions. And here we have a creative task where we want to see if kids are willing to break the mold and use subtraction. So here, we teach them how to make 5 using addition, but then on a later task we say, you could use addition or subtraction, and everybody's told they can use subtraction. And if you use subtraction, you can make a longer equation to get the answer. You can make 10 using subtraction with 4 or 5, whereas with addition, you can only get 3. And one thing that we're finding is that we see a similar result with some students with this restriction around pedagogy. So in first grade, kids are very unlikely to use subtraction. This maybe they're not very expert with it. We see in third grade, kids are a little bit more likely to use subtraction in the first place. But in this kind of middle ground, in these second graders, we see that students in the pedagogical condition look a lot like first graders. They're not very likely to use subtraction. But in this accidental condition, we see that kids are way more likely to use subtraction, suggesting something about seeing this kind of accidental demonstration frees up the mind to say, I'm going to explore and do other things. I'm going to try something different that I haven't seen before. So this implication for instructional strategies potentially influencing creative problem solving. Now, if you're a teacher, you're probably saying, this is all really cool and interesting, but this is completely unrealistic in a teaching context, right? So how do I do accidental teaching in my classroom? Not very realistic. Also, teachers bring a lot of baggage into the classroom with them. They have their own beliefs about what is important to teach and whether creativity is valuable. And so these kind of experimental procedures don't get us at the answer. It shows us that kids' thinking may be manipulated and changed by instructional strategies, but it doesn't say what's happening in an actual classroom. So motivation researchers have certainly studied the way that teachers set up classrooms. We call them like motivational microclimates. And it means that teachers have the opportunity to set up an environment where students can enact certain kinds of behaviors. They might encourage creativity or do things that allow students to be creative. And also teachers might communicate their own beliefs and ideas that then get fostered into the children about creativity. So what I want to do at this part of the talk is to shift from this conversation of how students' motivational beliefs might lead to creative behaviors and think about how teachers' motivational beliefs might lead them to enact classroom behaviors that support creativity in the classroom. And that's where I'm going to turn it over to Andrea. And if I leave unceremoniously at the end of this, it's because I have a class at 11:10. So it's not because I don't want to hear from all of you.
All right, thanks, Michael. So as Michael was talking about, creativity is really an important task in schools, but we don't always see it as a priority, and it's not always something that we think about within a classroom environment. So schools still aren't necessarily cultivating classroom spaces where kids can engage in creative thinking on a regular basis. And so there's a lot of different reasons that we could examine for why this is happening, but I think one that's most interesting to me is to look at the teachers. And part of this is because I used to be an elementary school teacher, but part of this is because teachers have a lot of control over what's happening within these spaces. And as Michael was mentioning, they're kind of creating this environment where students are developing not only skills, but also beliefs about learning. And teachers within this process are actively making decisions about what does this environment actually look like. And so if we think instead, based on some of what Michael was saying, not necessarily looking at what is an experimenter saying, but what's an instructor in a classroom saying that's kind of leading students to develop certain skills and certain beliefs. And so within this, that means that teachers also have a lot of influence over the types of opportunities that students might have for creative thinking and creative learning within a classroom. And I really wanted to look at this problem and kind of start with what are teachers thinking about creativity, and what are they thinking about fostering creativity within the classroom space. And so when we ask that, we're starting with more of a motivational question. And why do we start with beliefs? And essentially it's because beliefs have the opportunity to lead a person to action. And so specifically with teachers, beliefs can function as these more motivational filters for their instructional practice. So if we start kind of with this pathway of starting with teacher beliefs about creativity, we can think about some of the motivational constructs that those beliefs can lead to. So things like self-efficacy for teaching for creativity. So how confident are you that you can teach a student to be more creative? Mindset for creativity, so do you think it's something that you're born with, or is it a skill that you can actually practice and get better at? And then also, do you think that creativity is valuable for learning? And so how you're thinking about those things can lead into the types of behaviors that you're going to enact within your classroom space. And if we take it one step further, we can think about what types of opportunities then do these behaviors lead to for the actual students that are learning within that space.
Speak up just a little bit.
Yes, sorry. I did used to be a teacher, but it was a while ago, so I'm not used to talking loud again. Okay. Where was I? Sorry. So we can think about these motivational beliefs, right? But they can also be a barrier or something that enables these instructional behaviors or these instructional strategies to actually happen in the classroom. So if we think about a teacher with more of a fixed mindset who thinks that students' creativity is something that can't change, they're probably not going to incorporate a lot of behaviors or strategies within their classroom that would do so because they don't think that it's actually going to help their student, right? Versus someone with the opposite, like a growth mindset, who thinks that something they do is going to have an impact on that student's creativity. They might incorporate more of those strategies because they're going to see the outcomes in their students. And so all of this kind of led me to think about teachers and undergraduates and what does this process look like. And so we decided to study this. And we came up with 2 questions, starting with first, how do teachers define creativity? And then second, how do teachers' motivational beliefs about creativity relate to their instructional strategies? And so for the undergraduate section of the study, because they're not actually teaching, we switched this second question to look more at what are their perceived, we switched it to have them think more hypothetically as if they were a teacher in a classroom, and we also switched these instructional strategies to look at what is their perceived importance, how important do they think those strategies are in a classroom, and then also perceived difficulty, so how hard would it be to actually do those strategies in the classroom. And we ended up with 2 studies. So in the first study, we had actual practicing teachers. And then in the second, we had undergraduate students who were enrolled in educational psychology classes. But about half of those students did intend to become teachers. And so both samples completed an online survey where they were answering items on their beliefs about creativity, instructional strategies, and then also an open-ended definition of creativity. And we actually started with the open-ended question by just asking, what does creativity mean to you? To kind of see how are they defining creativity. And then teachers moved into rating how often they used certain instructional behaviors within their classroom. And so we used what's called the Creativity Fostering Teacher Behavior Index. This was based off of Arthur Crockley's work on his general principles for fostering creativity in the classroom. And there's a lot of different ways that you can foster creativity in the classroom, and so we wanted to use a scale that kind of showed the broad range of things that you could do that could potentially lead to student creativity. And so this included items like I leave open-ended questions for my students to find the answer to themselves, or I don't mind my students trying out their own ideas and deviating from what I have shown them. So all of the items were things that you could do that could potentially lead to student creativity. And as I said, for the undergraduates, we shortened this scale and we changed the wording to be more hypothetical, so they were thinking about that hypothetical future classroom as if they were a teacher. And then finally, we gave all participants a researcher-based definition of creativity before they answered all of these items on their creative beliefs. And so we had self-efficacy for teaching for creativity. Are you confident that you can make a student creative? Value, do you think that creativity enhances learning? We've talked about mindset, right? Can it change or not? And then we also included some measures on need for closure. So when you're teaching, how comfortable are you with more ambiguous situations or things that are a little bit uncertain? We also asked about anxiety. So we gave them certain situations and asked, how anxious does this make you feel? So having to think in an open-ended way, how anxious does that make you feel? Or if you have to solve a problem differently from others, things like that. And then finally, for actual practicing teachers, we asked about perceived environmental support for the school that they are currently at. So does their administration and the overall school culture, is it supportive of helping kids become more creative or not? And so what did we find? Starting with that open-ended question, we developed a coding scheme to kind of categorize the ways that teachers and undergraduates were defining creativity. And so we started with some attributes that are already found in research for creativity, but then we went through these responses and also noticed some common themes that we had not yet included. And so we added those to our coding scheme. And then we went through all the responses and they were coded for how many themes they included in their responses. And so you can see that across both samples, the idea of novelty was an attribute that came up really often in a lot of responses. So teachers and undergraduates were pretty likely to recognize that creativity is something that's new or original or unique. And this is in line with a lot of prior research that's been done on teachers' beliefs about creativity. So it's common for people to recognize that creativity means newness, right? And something I thought was interesting was that teachers and undergraduates often got this across by saying that it's your ability to think outside the box, and that expression was used quite commonly. But if you are somebody who's familiar with creativity, we know that it's not just something that's novel, but it's often also something that's useful or relevant. And you can see that attribute did not come up quite as often. It did some, so you can see that some people included this idea within their response, but this is also consistent with a lot of prior research in that you're not necessarily recognizing this other piece of creativity, which is that it's actually helpful. And this might be part of why those beliefs are not necessarily connecting to practice, because you don't recognize creativity as something that's useful for a lot of different subjects, or that is even useful to learning at all. Something else that was interesting was that within those creative belief scales, growth creative mindset was rated really highly within both samples. So they thought that, creativity was for everyone. It's something that can grow and improve. But within these open-ended definitions, it rarely came up in how they were describing it. So this idea of changeability was not always there. And you can see that malleability is very low within both samples. So a few people did talk about it, but not very many. And then finally, another interesting thing that we noticed was this idea of creativity not only being recognized as something that's new, but also as a way that you can express yourself or your identity or your ideas. And I think this is important because it's showing that creativity for this group of people is not necessarily something that's new, but also it's a tool for personal growth. And I think, as Michael talked about earlier, schools and teachers think about learning and kids in school not only as, you're just there to learn academic things, but you're fostering a lot of other things in students when they're there. And so I think this kind of highlights another way that we can think about creativity in classrooms, right? It's not just to help kids become better thinkers and more creative thinkers, but it's also a way that they can kind of have personal insights and personal growth. Okay, so after after we did the open-ended stuff, we switched to the belief and the behavior measures, and we ran some regressions to see which beliefs might predict certain behaviors. And what we found within the teacher sample was that creative self-efficacy was the strongest and the only significant predictor of those creative teaching behaviors. And so this is showing that a teacher's confidence in whether or not they can do this is the thing that is having the most impact on these types of behaviors. And then within the undergraduate sample, again, looking at perceived importance and perceived difficulty. For perceived importance, again, self-efficacy was the strongest and only significant predictor. For perceived difficulty, lower self-efficacy, along with need for closure and fixed creative mindset, all significantly predicted how much or how difficult they thought it would be to actually do these things in a classroom. And so I think we can see that across this sample, right, they think that creativity is important, and it might be because they don't actually have some teaching experience, they're finding it a little bit more difficult to actually put these things into place within a classroom. And so I think looking at the perceptions of importance and difficulty can help us think about the difference between valuing something, but then what might actually get in the way of doing that thing in the long run. And so some of these more rigid beliefs might be something that's impacting whether or not you're actually going to put these practices into place. If you think it's going to be really hard or you anticipate it's going to be really difficult to actually do it, you're probably less likely to do so. Yeah, so it's not necessarily that the more rigid beliefs are undermining value or importance for this thing, but it might be impacting how confident you are in actually being able to do it. So if we look at both samples together, we have this really strong theme of self-efficacy being the most consistently tied to behaviors in the sense of actual behaviors or your perception of behaviors. So how confident you are impacts how likely you were to actually use some of these behaviors. And then for undergraduates, those more maladaptive beliefs can come into play as more of a barrier to whether or not you feel efficacious in doing those things. So I think this idea of confidence is important, especially for teaching for creativity, because that's often like an open-ended and uncertain experience for teachers. So if you're more confident, you might be more likely to experiment in your teaching, you might be more able to kind of tolerate ambiguity within student responses or student questions that they have, right? You might be more likely to deviate from more traditional instruction because you have that confidence. And so I think this idea of increasing creative self-efficacy is one way that we can help kind of take those positive beliefs and try and actually translate them into concrete classroom behaviors. So why is it important to take a motivational approach? And I think what we've seen is that motivation does matter because it has the potential to actually shape the beliefs and the behaviors of teachers. And those more confident teachers are more likely to use some of these behaviors in the classroom. I think as researchers, we can think about what are ways that we can foster this self-efficacy in teachers and younger teachers and pre-service teachers. And so maybe that's designing certain activities that specifically target self-efficacy and having mastery experiences for those students and teachers. And then also recognizing what do these beliefs look like from early on, right? From people who are learning how to be teachers, right? Because some of these other motivational beliefs might play a role in how confident they feel in the long run of actually taking on a more teaching for creativity approach in the classroom. So I think we need to keep thinking about these things within the future.
Yeah, so to kind of sum things up, to think about this journey we've gone on, we started with this idea that motivational beliefs might lead you to different kind of creative actions, and then zoomed out to think about how teachers might set up environments for students to practice some of these things. As we kind of move forward, I think our goal is to try to connect these two dots together from a motivation perspective and from a teaching perspective. And I think in the future what we would see is that so far we've looked at this like teacher self-report for creative behaviors, but what we'd really like to do next is kind of go into the classrooms and see what teachers are actually doing. It's great to use this as a start to say what are teachers saying they're doing, but what are teachers actually doing and how is what they're actually doing setting students up to believe that creativity is important, to think that they can be creative, and then that might lead to their actual use of creativity in the classroom. So I think that's all we've got, but thank you all for your time.